Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is October 1st, right? We're kind of getting into the fall now. The weather is cooling off a little bit. I think that's wonderful. Before we talk about the material, I want to remind everybody that next week is our first exam, our midterm exam. This is an in-class exam. As I said earlier, I am making it available on Tuesday or Thursday. You pick a day. You decide when you want to come. I hope a lot of you will come on Tuesday. Let's get it over with. Obviously, you don't do anything on Thursday if you do that. But in class, so show up here. We're going to socially distance. We may even use a different classroom if enough of us show up on one day, but that'll be fine. In the event that you are COVID quarantined, certainly don't come here. But what you need to do, again, is get in touch with me so that we can come up with proctor arrangements, because this does have to be a proctored exam. So be here Tuesday or Thursday during class time, even you folks at home, and we will go from there. Now, as for the test itself, everybody's taking tests. We know how all of that works. There's going to be some multiple choice questions. There's going to be some short answer questions. There's going to be an essay question. I'll put 2 essay questions on there, and then you'll do one of them. You'll get to choose which one you want to answer. So you'll have some choice on that, which is good. I will be posting an announcement on the website this afternoon, which discusses a lot of this. I'll give you some essay topics to study. So definitely check the Canvas today so you can read that announcement. As for the material, it is everything in modules 1, 2, and 3. And of course, there's a study guide with a bunch of terms, so you can use those terms to help you learn everything. Keep in mind, I haven't been able to discuss everything in the lectures. There's material in the modules that we didn't get to. So the material in the modules is what I want you to make sure that you know. The book is great. The book is a great reference. That being said, nothing will be on the test that I don't actually have in the posted material. Okay, there's nothing that I didn't talk about in that material, so that's what you need to study. I promise you there are no trick questions. There's nothing that I'm going to pull in from left field, nothing designed to confuse you or throw you off or anything like that. I'm not that kind of instructor. And as far as I'm concerned, the test is really easy. I took it, made 100, right? No problem at all, right? I found the test to be extremely simple. So there you go. Also, just remember with tests like this, all it really is testing your memory, right? You study the material, you come in here, you spit it back out on the test and you make an A, right? It's not like we're doing calculus or anything like that. So that's called rote memory, and I'm sure that everybody will do just fine. But once again, it is an in-class test unless you are COVID quarantined. So get in touch with me if you fall into that latter category. With that in mind, are there any questions? Anything at all? Okay. All right, that's very cool. And if anything comes to mind during the lecture, just raise it, because there might be people at home also that are thinking about it. So, when we last left off, we had declared war on Britain in 1812 because obviously we were crazy at the time. We were in no position to wage war against the British Empire. It was a superpower, even more powerful than it had been in 1776. And there was just no realistic way we could hope to win in any military sense. Now, we did believe that we stood a chance because the British are busy fighting Napoleon, and so we're not going to be important to them. And so it's not like we're going to be taking on the whole empire. They have French dictators to deal with. But we didn't really understand that they weren't going to allow themselves to lose either. And so even though this really was kind of a side item for them, nonetheless, they were able to send over enough very well-trained and now, of course, experienced, because they've been fighting in Europe for a few years, soldiers. And, of course, they still had their navy, and they just pretty much won every single battle. The most devastating is probably the capture and burning of Washington, D.C., which they did in 1812, burning the White House, burning the Library of Congress, and pretty much every other building. And that's also unfortunately why a lot of records from before 1812 have now been lost. We don't have the census, for example, from 1810 and 1790 because they were burned. All those census records were destroyed, and a lot of other stuff too. It's really sad. There is no single surviving piece of furniture from the White House that dates back to before this era, because everything in the White House was burned. As a matter of fact, I think there's one picture that was taken off the wall by President Madison's wife, Dolly Madison, and that's the only item from the White House that dates back to before this era, because the whole building was burned. War is not something you're supposed to voluntarily do. If I can give y'all any advice when you find yourselves in position of leadership, just remember, war is not fun, it is not glorious, and there are no winners. And just about every war that's ever been fought did not turn out the way the people thought it was going to when they started it. You know, they always start the war thinking it will be one thing, and it turns out to be something very different and much, much worse. So keep that in mind. Anyway, we would argue, of course, that 1814 is a low point in American history. There's never really been a point where we have been more defeated and more lowly in that sense, with perhaps the exception of maybe the height of the Great Depression. That was pretty rough as well. That being said, we were able to pull a couple of victories out of this that led us to still feel patriotic and led us to argue that, maybe we won this. Maybe we won this. And one of these victories is political in nature. You see, when we declared war on Britain, they decided that the easiest way to deal with us, and we had been pretty pesky for them over the past few years, was to not just defeat us militarily, but to overthrow our government, get rid of the Constitution, and either implement a pro-British government, turn us into a puppet state of the British Empire, or turn us into a colony again. Just recolonize and bring us back into the empire. And then that little chapter of independence can sort of be glossed over. Britain failed at that. The American public would not go along with either one. They got too involved with Napoleon even after they defeated us. In 1814, Napoleon is absolutely against the ropes. You know, he is about to be defeated. And so the British are done with the U.S. They are going to go take him out. So they weren't able to overthrow the government. Despite burning Washington, D.C., the Constitution survived. Our government survived. The United States remained the United States. And our ability to survive being beaten up like that is a testament. And it was a testament to our desire to keep the country going. And so that was a victory. If ever there was a time our nation would cease to exist, it was in 1814, and it didn't happen. Secondly, there were a couple of victories that we did win that are from actually a different set of wars. Sort of. You see, also at the very same time that the War of 1812 started, we went to war with Western Indian tribes. And these were wars within the war, if you will. These were not actually part of the War of 1812, or not entirely. And there were two very substantial victories that were won. In the north, General William Henry Harrison crushed the Shawnee for good at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The Shawnee were crushed permanently by Harrison at Tippecanoe. Now, this made him a national hero. This made him immensely popular because, of course, these were at the time seen as the savage natives that are attacking and scalping all of these nice, peaceful settlers, when the situation we know now was a heck of a lot more complex than that. Yes, there was plenty of attacking and scalping. It just happened to take place on both sides. And we know now that it was the white settlers that were the aggressors. And even though the U.S. government did not want those settlers to be taking action against the natives, they certainly weren't going to stop it either. So it's not what we think it is. But nonetheless, Harrison is now a hero. So we can say we won a big victory. We defeated those savages to the north. Also, in the South, in 1813, a group of Creek Indians overran a small outpost in Alabama, Fort Mims. and there were a little over 100 whites in their families, and the Creeks just killed them all. The men, the women, the children, you name it, they came in and they just wiped them all out. And it was called the Fort Mims Massacre. And whether or not those whites needed to be there and whether or not they were squatters, well, we can certainly sort that one out. But nonetheless, what the Creeks did to them was seen as just savagery, and it turned the American people deeply against any real cooperation with them. Up in Tennessee, the Tennessee Militia General, Andrew Jackson, responded by organizing the Tennessee militia. He invaded what is today Alabama, and after a year-long campaign that had been very difficult, he defeated the Creeks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And Horseshoe Bend is a river, and the river makes a horseshoe, and that's why it's called Horseshoe Bend, and that's where the battle took place. And he crushed the Creeks, much like Harrison crushed the Shawnee. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Jackson. I won't get into everything about him. We'll get into some of the more colorful details when we talk about him becoming president. But what we do need to know is that he was a wealthy planter in Tennessee. He was probably the most aggressive, ornery, uncooperative bastard that has ever lived, and everybody knew it. Early in the war, he actually put together a group of militiamen that went down the Mississippi River to defend New Orleans, because there was a fear that the British would invade New Orleans. But President Madison didn't like Jackson. You know, to be honest with you, nobody liked Jackson, okay? I mean, the number of people that considered Jackson a friend could probably be counted on one hand. And so when Jackson got there, a message had already arrived from Madison not to give him command, and that in fact New Orleans was not under threat, and so Jackson's soldiers were simply to be commanded by another general down there. So thank you for bringing all of these soldiers. You go home and they can stay here if they want. Which of course infuriated Jackson, so he marched his men back home through Mississippi, where he was given the nickname Old Hickory because he was so tough and ornery and uncooperative. Then, of course, the Creeks attacked. He defeated them at Horseshoe Bend, and now he is a national hero. Well, after the defeat of the Creeks, in late 1814, we catch wind that the British are going to invade New Orleans. And the city is completely undefended. The British are going to be able to waltz right into the city. Now, you will remember earlier, New Orleans is the gateway to the Mississippi River. In fact, whoever controls New Orleans controls commerce for the entire interior of the continent, stretching from basically the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachians. New Orleans is a gateway to the country that simply cannot be lost. There was also a greater fear that if the British took New Orleans, it would give them the ability to effectively take the Louisiana Purchase. They would then be able to send their army up the river. They would be able to take all of that Western territory that we had just bought from Napoleon about 10 years earlier. And there's one thing about the British Empire that you need to understand. Once they take something, they don't give it back. And they are in a period of imperial expansion as we speak. So this is an existential threat to what the United States is. Madison contacted Jackson and asked him to go down and defend the city. Now remember, 2 years earlier, he had shown up to defend the city and had been told to go home, and Jackson was just as mad as he can be. And getting Andrew Jackson mad is not a good idea. Madison had no choice. Somebody has to go defend that city. There is nobody in that part of the country that can do it. And the only man with any real military experience that's won a battle at this point is Jackson and Harrison, and Jackson's closer. So Jackson went back to New Orleans and proceeded to put together an army of anybody he could find. You know, he put out a call that if you have a gun and you're willing to shoot at redcoats, come join me. He offered freedom to any slave that would fight. He offered amnesty to any of the pirates that would show up. There was a notorious pirate, Jean Lafitte. And, you know, pirates are tough guys that know how to fight. And so, you know, he said, you know, you're a wanted man and, you know, there's a price on your head, but if you and all your pirates will fight with us, you'll get amnesty. And Lafitte and all of his pirates joined him. Militiamen start kind of showing up from everywhere, but remember, there's not much of a white presence in Mississippi, Alabama. I mean, they're coming from Tennessee, they're coming from Kentucky. One group of men showed up from Kentucky with no weapons, and it was described that they were naked because all of their clothes had sort of been worn off of them through the long trip. Remember, we don't have interstate highways at this time. They've got to march through the woods, and their clothes basically weren't even on them anymore. But anybody that will fight, we've got to fight the British. And the British are going to show up, and they are going to have thousands of redcoats that are extremely well disciplined, extremely well armed, extremely well trained. They have years of experience on the continent. And I've got a ragtag group of anybody with no real experience, no real officer corps. We're in trouble. As a matter of fact, the British set their boats up on the barrier islands out here before they went into the city. Well, what ended up happening? What ended up happening is here's the Battle of Tippecanoe, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. What happened was the most lopsided victory, not just of the entire war, but of that entire era. The Battle of New Orleans, where Jackson and his men set up a big berm to hide behind, and the British charged at him, and Jackson and his men just mowed them down. There were 3,000 British soldiers, probably about 1,000 men fighting for Jackson. And when it was over with, 1,000 of the British had been killed. The rest had just been broken and retreated. Jackson lost 8 men.
Wow.
Yeah, 8. That's it.
Dang.
Yeah, dang is right. I mean, it was just a stomping. And this picture of here, this picture of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, obviously that's not accurate. Andrew Jackson was, not going to hide quite that way. I mean, this man was, in every sense of the word, the Terminator. He had already been shot several times before this, just in case you're wondering, and nobody seemed to be able to kill him. And he never had any real concern for his own personal safety either. I mean, he was just not like normal people. In any event, this was an absolutely glorious victory for the United States. I mean, we put the hurt on the British like no country had ever done in the history of the empire. You would have to go back to the Middle Ages to find the English lose such a lopsided victory, and even then you probably couldn't, a lopsided defeat, even then you probably couldn't find one. So, of course, what this means is Andrew Jackson is a hero. I mean, he is a huge hero. The American people cheer him on, and he is a modern George Washington, if you will. He is being compared to Washington at this point. What we know now is that a peace treaty had actually been signed before the Battle of New Orleans. A few days earlier, the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, which ended the war. But The war was still technically going on because the U.S. Congress hadn't ratified the treaty. It hadn't even been brought back to the U.S. Certainly nobody knew about that in New Orleans. And so it's often been taught this battle was unnecessary because the war had technically ended. Not true. Not true. What we also know, and this is very important to understand, that if the British had won at New Orleans and taken the city and then had the interior of the continent open to them, we can 100% guarantee that the peace treaty ending the war would have immediately been torn up and they would have renegotiated based on an entirely different set of terms. We even know this. When I say 100%, we do know this because documents have now been found from the Prime Minister, Lord Castlereagh, to the British commander. Once you take New Orleans, do not give it up. We are not giving this back to the Americans when this war ends. So the British were going to take this, win or lose. So what Jackson did was save the existence of the United States effectively west of the Appalachians. We would have been pushed back to our colonial borders had it not been for the victory at New Orleans. And so don't assume that this battle was somehow unnecessary. It was very much, if you're wanting America to look like America. Now, we're going to see Jackson go on and have a more colorful career because what this does is puts him on path to the presidency, and William Henry Harrison too, by the way. Both men will end up becoming president. So the Battle of New Orleans gave Americans the argument that we really did win. You know, the British did not overthrow our government, and when the war was finally coming to an end, we put it to them and we won. So that's what that's all about. We got to rebuild the White House in Washington, D.C., of course. So now the war is over. I think I mentioned last time the Hartford Convention, which discusses possibly seceding from the United States. That is no longer going to be discussed. That was put to bed pretty quickly when it's obvious that it's going to come to an end. It is at this time that Americans start celebrating the ideals of the unique American experience. We become American patriots as a result of the War of 1812. This is when we start really celebrating what it means to be America. It isn't a coincidence that the national anthem comes from a battle from the War of 1812, right? You know, we've all heard Francis Scott Key, right? When the British were attacking in Baltimore, he was sitting back and he was watching this. And of course, the British couldn't take that fort. It was much like New Orleans. They tried and we held them off and we ended up winning. After this politically, James Madison does not run for a second term. Again, that tradition of 2 terms is now pretty well set. And of course, Madison's getting kind of old too, so he doesn't need to be president. Madison doesn't run for a 3rd term, excuse me. Somebody else is getting old apparently. I'm having a few senior moments maybe. The next president elected in 1816 is James Monroe. The next president elected is James Monroe. He is the last founding father to serve as president. The first 5 presidents were founding fathers who played a role in creating the country. I don't need to tell you that by now they're all getting kind of old anyway. It's not like we have any of them left. So Monroe is really the last one. Monroe was also a Virginia planter, like Jefferson and like Madison. Monroe fell into that category as well. As a planter, he was a bit of a jerk. Got to be honest with you. Never had any problem with slavery and is known to have not been particularly benevolent to his, but I guess that's neither here nor there when it comes to his presidency. Monroe was perfectly competent. He was a Jeffersonian. He believed in the America of small farmers and the Jefferson ideal. And now that the Jeffersonians have won 5 elections in a row, and we have moved past the colonial era, we've moved past sort of that constitutional era, the Federalist Party just kind of goes away. There are no more Federalists. Our 2-party system is sort of in disarray. And we spend about 6 or 7 years without clear political parties. We don't have a two-party system going on. And this is described by historians. This is called the era of good feelings. Now, I can assure you there was plenty of debating in politics and plenty of back and forth and et cetera, et cetera. Politicians are who they are. It's just we don't have a party system. You know, what party do you belong to and what party do you belong to? I don't know. It's more of a local thing. That being said, the Federalists did get some victories before they dissolved. They were able to get a lot of their platform put in place. It isn't as if what they wanted went away. It's just they ceased to exist as a party. So there's three issues here that I want to discuss that the Federalists were very much behind that they're going to get. The first is going to be the bank. The first is going to be the bank. This was pushed by the Federalists. You will recall that Alexander Hamilton wants to create a Bank of the United States and let the federal government assume the state debt. This was the Federalist platform, and Jefferson hated it. And in return, the South got the nation's capital. Y'all remember that compromise that we talked about? Well, the Bank of the United States was chartered for 20 years, and I'm going to explain to you how the bank works, because we're going to need to understand it later. So in 1816, 20 years had passed, and we have to decide if we want to keep the bank. Well, we kept the bank. We chartered it for another 20 years, so the Federalists win that. Now, what does that mean? When is the bank going to expire again? Which is 1836, right? And Jackson is president then, and we're going to have a lot of fun with that. But in 1816, the bank is rechartered for another 20 years, and this is the second Bank of the United States because the first one was the first Bank of the United States. Now, how does the bank work? What am I talking about here? Of course, you know, we've got banks. Banks exist. Well, here's how the bank worked. The bank was a private company. It was a private institution. There were shareholders in it that made a profit from it. And what the bank did was hold the U.S. Treasury. When money was collected by the federal government through Western land sales or through the tariff, the bank was the bank that held the money. So we have a private bank holding the American Treasury. Is everyone hearing that? What that bank would then do is loan money to private independent banks throughout the country. So we have the big mama bank, the mothership bank, which holds the Treasury, and it is willing to loan money out to small private banks for you ordinary people to go borrow from. Are y'all following me here? Right? Now, the money that you borrow from the small bank may not actually be currency created by the big bank. It might be their own local currency. Banks would issue their own money instead of the money that they held in their vault. And that money was not always considered as strong or as trustworthy. Now, why is this controversial? Well, it's controversial because if you are a shareholder in the Bank of the United States, you have a financial interest in the bank operating a certain way. And if you've got a briefcase with an awful lot of green paper in here, and we've got some senators over here that might be considering legislation that restricts what the bank can do, I might just leave this on your desk and walk out of the room, and you're going to vote any way I want. Are you following me? And so opponents of the bank argued that what we've got are business interests, private people, able to use their money to influence politicians. The bank is a powerful organization that does not answer to the people. It's holding our federal treasury. Are you getting me? It wants as much money as possible in the federal treasury. It wants to fill those coffers with money, which means it wants to increase taxes, doesn't it? It wants to increase the tariff. It wants to sell more Western land. Now, increasing the tariff might not be good for the American people, but it's darn sure good for the bank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little briefcase here and I'm going to say, okay, Senator, I want you to increase the tariff. And if you think those senators aren't listening, you don't know how money works. And let's make this a little bit scarier. What about you bank shareholders? What if y'all aren't even American? What if y'all are British and you hold shares in the federal bank? And you are owning the bank that holds the U.S. Treasury, y'all understand we got a problem there. So yes, the bank is good for the economy in terms of regulating the currency and maintaining stability and et cetera, et cetera. There's just issues why maybe it's not the best. And so the Jeffersonians would say, this is terrible. This is a bad idea. Private entities should not be able to influence lawmakers because private entities are not interested in what's good for the American people. They're interested in profit. And when they show up with a big bag of money, they're going to get what they want. Anyway, the Federalists get the bank. It's chartered for another 20 years, and you better believe the opponents of the bank are saying 20 years is as long as it's going to last. Secondly, big surprise, the Federalists get a bigger tariff. And the tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. The tariff is a tax on imported goods. And by now, the tariff is a big political issue. By now, the tariff is something that people are debating in a big way. Now, bear with me. Bear with me. I know this is a little complex, but I need you to follow me here, okay? And I'll repeat myself if I get a little ahead of you. I've got an idea. Let's say the British, and we don't like the British right now, right? Those stinking British, with their rotten teeth and their bad food, we don't like them. And the French are importing goods and selling them in the United States, which means we're giving them money. We're buying their products, right? So here's a great idea. Let's put a tax on those goods, right? Let's tax those British and those French. So their goods are going to be more expensive. Let's make money off of them. Are y'all following me? Sounds great. Let them give money to the Treasury. Why might that be controversial? Why might that be something that maybe we need to rethink? First and foremost, if we slap a heavy tariff on imported British goods, they're going to do the same thing to us, aren't they? If we're importing British manufactured goods, they're going to say, fine, United States. If we're taxing British manufactured goods, they're going to turn around and say, okay, fine, America, we're taxing your tobacco and your cotton when you send it to us. Y'all get where I'm coming from? We implement a tariff on them, they're going to slap a tariff on us. Now, you might say, well, it's only fair. If you live in, say, Boston, and let's pick a British product. Let's say shoes. The British are importing shoes. And the British shoes are high quality and they're cheap. And people keep buying British shoes and giving the British all the money. And you are a shoemaker. Here, how about you? You're a shoemaker in Boston. You want a tariff on shoes, don't you? Because you want to sell your shoes. You don't want people buying the British shoes. So we're going to slap a tariff on British shoes. So now everybody buys American shoes instead. Those British shoes are too expensive. So now we're going to buy American shoes. And when we buy the British shoes, we're paying a tax into the Treasury. So Britain says, okay, fine. You're going to tax our shoes. We're going to tax your tobacco. Well, who gets hurt when the British tax the tobacco? It ain't the guy in Boston. Who's the guy that gets hurt? Maybe the person in North Carolina that grows the tobacco, right? So we slapped a tariff on shoes, which is great for Boston, bad for North Carolina. You following me?
So if we sent them tobacco and they taxed it, aren't they selling it still?
Well, they didn't turn around and sell it, of course.
Them still, like, no one has it?
Maybe, maybe not. What if it's cotton? Because you see, the British import cotton from the United States, and they have cotton coming in from Egypt as well, and India. You see? So now the American cotton is too expensive, and the Egyptian and the Indian cotton, which is part of the British Empire, is now cheaper. You see where I'm coming from? So you're right about that. If it's a product that doesn't have other sources, tariff issues get complicated. I'm trying to keep it simple, right? But ultimately, the idea here is when we slap a tariff on something, one group of people end up doing well with it, another group of people end up getting hurt by it. Y'all get what I'm saying, right? And of course, the tobacco refiners in Britain don't want a tariff on tobacco because they want tobacco to be cheaper, right? So now they're debating a tariff over in Britain, right? So that's where we go. But it gets even more complicated than that. Oh, we're not even done. We're going to play with some funny numbers here. These are made up numbers, but it's designed to show you what I mean. Let's say that our shoemaker over here, can sell a pair of his shoes and make a profit, a fair profit. We'll call this American. Let's say he can make a pair of shoes and he can sell them for $1. So as long as his shoes cost $1, he makes a profit. Good for him, and I say buy American. Great guy, you bet. But of course the British, because they have their fancy machines and because they're going through an industrial revolution that we're not, they can sell their shoes for 50 cents. Whoops, I can't write. Senior moment, folks. They can sell their shoes for 50 cents. Everybody's going to buy the 50-cent shoes, folks. It's the free market. I'm all for buying American, but I'm not going to pay twice as much for my shoes, right? And neither are you. Look at where yours were made. Here's a hint. It wasn't in the United States. Okay, so the shoe guy shows up and he says, okay, Congress, we need a tax on shoes. We need a tariff on shoes. These British, they're putting us out of business. There's no way we can compete with that. We got to have a tariff on shoes. And the North Carolina people say, well, if we slap a tariff on shoes, they're going to slap a tariff on tobacco and cotton, and we can't afford that. And I'm sympathetic, Boston. I really get it, but that's going to hurt us. So, I don't want a tariff. I'm willing to understand that you got to be in business, but here's a problem. So Congress finally decides we got to protect domestic industry. We got to put a tariff on shoes. So what do you think a good tariff should be to make sure that this guy can make a decent, honest profit?
Can't they both sell at the same price?
What's that?
Can't they sell at the same price?
So why don't we put a 50-cent tariff, right? So now the British shoes are $1 too, right? So both shoes are $1 and we can compete, right? Him and all of his buddies are going to fill up their little briefcase full of money. And they're going to go to the senator and say, I don't think we want a 50-cent tariff. I think we want $1 tariff. Let's make those British shoes $1.50. We're not going to just be cheaper than them. We're going to hit them just as hard as they hit us. And hey, $1 tariff makes more money, doesn't it? A $1 tariff on those shoes not only puts us at a big competitive advantage, but it brings more money into the treasury. And when the British find that out, they say, well, fine, if you can slap a huge tariff on those shoes, you better see what we're going to do to your tobacco and your cotton. Because the tariff we slap on that is going to be hurtful too. Y'all get where I'm coming from? But it gets even more interesting. Let's say the tariff passes and a huge tariff now gets put on tobacco and cotton in Britain because we just hit them so hard with our big tariff. He doesn't sell his shoes for $1 anymore. He sells his shoes for $1.49. Y'all see where I'm coming from? He's still cheaper. It just so happens that he can make a huge profit now that is unfair. You see where I'm coming from? And so this tariff is now giving him the ability to exploit the American people with higher prices, and it's destroying the tobacco and cotton industry in the South. You see where I'm coming from? The tariff is not simple. The tariff is not simple. People get hurt with the tariff and people benefit with the tariff. It all just depends on who you were. You will recall before I started this class, sorry folks at home, how do people ultimately make decisions? Their own interests, right? People vote their own interests. People will argue their own interests. And so the Boston shoemaker is going to put forth the best argument in the world on why we need the tariff. It's because it helps him. The tobacco farmer and cotton farmer are going to argue why we don't. It helps them. And Congress is going to start having people show up with briefcases full of money to change their opinion. You get where I'm coming from? Now do you understand why people like Jefferson said we need a government that doesn't do a whole lot of foreign policy? We need a small government that doesn't deal with money that much. Because the more we do this sort of thing, the more corrupt it becomes. And then you have guys like Hamilton saying, we have to do this sort of thing. We have to grow our economy. We have to promote business. We have to promote banks. You just kind of have to decide where you stand on it, don't you? Gets complicated. When it all boils down, generally speaking, the North very much favored the tariff. Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry. Oh, of course, yeah. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, these big cities in the North benefit when we slap a tariff on imported goods. Because generally speaking, they're competing with those goods. The South, which always is the one that gets retaliated against, hates the tariff. Southerners hate the tariff. It means that their tobacco, their cotton, their hemp, their indigo, their rice, all gets hit with a nasty tariff overseas. And when they go to buy shoes, they're paying unfair prices, right? So I got to pay more money for the stuff I buy, and the stuff I'm selling doesn't sell as well. So Southerners, when the tariff starts really getting put into place, the Southerners start throwing a fit and saying, absolutely not, this is unfair. One section of the country benefits, another section of the country doesn't. The tariff's going to be a debate. But in 1816, the Federalists who like the tariff get their tariff. And the tariff is raised. Number three, the Federalists want federal spending on internal improvements. The Federalists want federal spending on internal improvements. What do I mean by that? They want federal roads, they want federal bridges, they want federal ports, they want federal canals. Now, I like roads, I like bridges, I like ports, I like canals. These are good things. I'm sure you do too. We want to have our economy grow. We know that we need things like that. Good port facilities mean we have import and export, and that's good for everybody, north and south. Good roads means commerce. It means communication and transportation, better quality of life. Everybody likes roads, north and south. The debate is who pays for it. Who pays for that road? Well, what's so terrible about the federal government paying for it? The federal government has the most money. A lot of these roads go from one place to another. These are expensive. Everybody benefits from commerce. Why shouldn't the federal government pay for internal improvements? Well, okay. Like the tariff, it's not so simple. And this one I can explain much more quickly. Let's say we need to build a road. And this road is going to cost a lot of money. And we can build this road from New York through Pennsylvania, or we can build this road from Virginia through the Carolinas. The people in New York say, how about we get the road, right? The people in Virginia say, how about we get the road? Now, if we build the road from New York into Pennsylvania, and everybody pays for it, that means the people in the South are paying for a road that the people in the North get to use. If you live in Virginia, does a New York to Pennsylvania road benefit you? No, but you paid for it, right? Let's say we're going to build a big port, and we're going to build the port in Norfolk, Virginia. Great for exporting tobacco and cotton. Do you New Yorkers, do y'all benefit from that port? Well, you paid for it. but the people in Virginia get it. So how do we decide where these roads get built? How do we decide where these ports get built? Who gets to make those decisions? Well, the people that make a lot of money building roads will show up with a briefcase full of money and say, I think we need this road here, right? The people that are good at building ports show up with a briefcase full of money and say, I think we need this port there. It may not be the best place for it, but it's the most profitable for them. And in Congress, you are a senator and you serve on the committee that decides where the port gets built. Now, I want you to think about this, and I'm looking at you, Senator. Let's say you are a senator from Virginia, and you are the ranking member of the committee that decides where we build the next port. I'll just ask you right now, what state is that port getting built in? Exactly. It's not going to be a coincidence that the person from Virginia that gets to decide is going to end up getting the port in Virginia, and everybody else pays for it. Y'all following me? So we're dealing with corruption here. We're dealing with people acting in their own self-interest. It is good to have infrastructure improvements. These things are positive for our economy. It's just that they introduce negative behavior, which again is why the Jeffersonian said the federal government doesn't need to build internal improvements. Just keep the federal government out of it. If Virginia wants a port, Virginia can pay for the port. If New York wants a road, New York can pay for the road. We might not get as many ports and roads and bridges and canals, but we won't get the corruption that comes with it too. Well, the Federalists got internal improvements. Not many at this time. This one is going to take a little while longer, so I'm not saying a lot. But the first federal road was constructed in 1808. The first road that goes from one state to another that is built and maintained by the federal government, 1808. And there's going to be some more spending on this as we move forward. So even though the Federalist Party dissolves, they get their second bank, they get their tariff, they get federal improvements, and we get the foundation for people who are going to stand up and say, we got to put an end to this before it gets out of hand. And the man who ultimately plants that flag and says no is Old Hickory. But we're not to him yet. Monroe did not like this. Monroe was also a Jeffersonian. He just didn't do a whole lot to stop it. Under President Monroe, John Quincy Adams was the Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams. Quincy, of course, got a very good education. He was also a very morally decent person in most respects. It is fair to say that he was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. I mean, he was a bit slow, if you know what I'm saying. And more than enough people would point this out. But morally speaking, he was a decent man who was not corrupt. Well, we'll get into that, but one of the most important aspects of this is that Quincy was a very early abolitionist. He hated slavery and was more than happy to let everybody know about it. And he spent his entire life making clear that this was the great flaw in our Constitution, the fact that we did not end slavery when we had a chance to do it. And now the cotton gin has come along and we're moving west with slavery. And if we don't put an end to slavery now, it is going to destroy that unity between the North and the South. I mean, he saw it coming and he said, we got to fix this because it's going to be ugly if we don't. So in that sense, we would consider him a statesman. He was also a pretty darn good Secretary of State. Again, we're not going to criticize him there. He negotiated the border between the United States and Canada. This is known as the Rush-Bagot Treaty. It was in 1817, which more or less negotiated the Canadian border, at least in the east. And this was considered a pretty big deal. But his big accomplishment, which really made him popular, was the purchase of Florida. The Adams-Onis Treaty, he was the Adams in the Adams-Onis Treaty. In 1819, gave the United States Florida and the Gulf Coast, where we are right now, pretty much all the way to New Orleans, for $5 million. Yeah, not a bad deal. Not a bad deal at all. Now, the truth behind this was that the Spanish Empire in the New World is rapidly dissolving at this point, and the Spanish figured that we're going to take it anyway. You know, in their mind, we were probably just going to take it, and so you might as well sell it rather than lose it. And this was backed up by the fact that Andrew Jackson had already invaded Florida. He had moved in with an army at Pensacola, and I'm not making this up. There were 2 British diplomats there, and he hung them both just because they were British diplomats and he didn't like them. Yeah, he decided they were spies and hung them. And they were like, we're not spies, really. He was like, yeah, tell it to the hangman. I'm telling you, he was not a nice person. But after what he had done to the Creeks and after what he had done to everybody else that gets in the way, when Andrew Jackson comes in with the army, it's a good idea to just say, okay, you win. So that's what the Spanish did. And actually, we didn't even give them $5 million. All we did was agree to pay Americans money that the Spanish owed them. There were a number of Americans that had Spanish bonds and that were owed money by the Spanish government. And so we agreed to pay them instead. So the Spanish didn't actually get any money out of it. They just got relieved of their own debt. But this, of course, makes Adams a very popular man. Much like the Louisiana Purchase, this was a huge amount of land. And, I guess old people are happy about it, right? Grandma and grandpa down at, La Boca Vista, right? It opened the door for all of that. Unfortunately, they play football in Florida too. And, I wouldn't mind if Florida State and Florida got a little bit worse, but anyway. This was actually criticized by some people because there was no air conditioning at the time, of course, and very few people that weren't Seminole lived in Florida, and many people thought that it was worthless land because it was so swampy and you'd get so sick, and it wasn't very good for agriculture, except maybe in the north. So a lot of people thought that this wouldn't be a very useful piece of property, but nonetheless, it is a huge chunk of land that we got for a steal. Toward the end of Monroe's second term, and yes, he wins in 1820, he negotiated a pivotal piece of American foreign policy, which recognizes that the United States is going to start flexing some muscles. The United States is going to start asserting itself on the world stage. He declared the Monroe Doctrine. Now, this was not an official piece of paper so much. It was a policy. It was a position that the United States would take. This is our viewpoint in the world. The United States will oppose any further European colonization of the Western Hemisphere. We are telling Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You are not welcome here anymore. You see, the Spanish Empire is dissolving, and there's a real fear that the British or French will come in and recolonize some of these new countries. Countries like Venezuela, countries like Bolivia, countries like Chile and Argentina. Now, they do not have their current borders, and they haven't been created quite that way yet, but that's what I'm saying. The British are going to show in and take over where the Spanish left off. And so what Monroe is saying is, no, you will not. These countries should be allowed to become independent democracies. The Western Hemisphere is off limits to European interference. Now, the Monroe Doctrine was unenforceable. We had no chance. We had just gotten, brutally defeated by the British less than 10 years earlier. We had no chance of enforcing this, and there is going to be plenty of European interference despite the Monroe Doctrine. But what it does is it establishes this notion that we now have a say in the matter. And it establishes the idea that the United States will remain an anti-colonial nation. We do not agree with colonization. We do not agree with one nation taking over another nation and ruling over those people. We are opposed to that. That was us. Not too long ago, we were a colonial people and we were ruled by the British, and they were not nice to us. And so we are going to oppose that. And that doctrine will carry us all the way into the modern era, despite the fact that we don't necessarily play by that rule. Finally, I want to talk about the Panic of 1819 and the Missouri Compromise, and we got to move very quickly. In 1819, the United States entered its first real economic recession as an independent country. Banks started to fail because they had loaned money too easily. And this was worsened by a bad European economy that was in a bad shape because of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, the wars were over by that point. The Napoleonic Wars had ended a few years earlier. But Britain was in terrible shape after the war. France was, of course, in terrible shape after the war. So they're not buying American products, and so that hurt the American economy. Banks started failing, and we entered a period of economic decline that hit us pretty hard for a few years. And this, of course, only heightens debate over the tariff. It heightens debate over whether or not banks should be allowed to do what they do. Because when banks fail, everybody with their money in the bank, well, they lose it all. Farmers that go into too much debt because of borrowing for land end up getting hurt by this. You know, the banks can fail all day long, and if you don't owe the bank any money, and if you don't have any money in the bank, you're fine, right? And so the Jeffersonians are saying this is exactly why we don't need to have these banks. This is why exactly, why we need to avoid debt, why we need to avoid tariffs and take care of ourselves. So this is going to cause a lot of debate between those two ideas. Now, we get out of the Panic of 1819 and everything gets back to normal. But there is another issue that will become even more contentious. And this is the Adams-Onis Treaty. That area down there, with the lines in it, that's what we get from Spain for $5 million. Now, I want you to look at that big old area right there that says Missouri Territory. By the 1820s, we are now going west of the Mississippi River. Settlers are now crossing that big divide in the continent and moving into the west. States that would later become Missouri, Arkansas, eventually Kansas, which is a whole new issue. And if we're going to keep moving west, we have to ask ourselves the big question that we keep having to deal with: what about slavery? We've already moved slavery into those orange states there. Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, all made possible because of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Whites can now settle that territory. North of the Ohio River, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, later Michigan. These will not be slave states because, of course, slavery is banned north of the Ohio River. And we're starting to see a sectional divide over slavery. And people like John Quincy Adams are saying, this isn't good, folks. This is too big an issue for us to be divided regionally over. So are we going to move slavery west of the Mississippi River? Will slavery march west with this country, or will slavery remain contained? Now think about the tariff. Southerners don't like the tariff, do they? Northerners do like the tariff. If the federal government slaps a heavy-duty tariff on British goods, the Southerners pay the price. And in 1816, that's exactly what happened. Now, Southerners had to grin and bear it. Southerners had to tolerate that because the federal government is what's making the rule. Y'all are following me, right? We gotta do what the federal government says. Bad for our region, but the federal government's in charge. And the Southerners start saying, the federal government had better not turn hostile to slavery. If the federal government starts passing legislation that's bad for our slaveholding, we're going to have a bigger issue. Now, the way we're going to make sure that the federal government stays pro-slavery, the way we're going to make sure that the federal government does not interfere with slavery, is to continue to add slave states to the nation. That big, gigantic Missouri territory right there, if that turns into 20 free states, we're going to have a country where slave states are a small minority in the federal government and the free states are everybody else. Are y'all following me? All of those free states will have the power in the Congress to pass whatever law they want. They will be electing the president who could hate slavery. They will pick members of federal courts who could rule against slavery. So, if we want to have a good representation in the federal government and make sure that slavery is protected, we are darn sure going to have new slave states. When we march west, some of those states have to have slaves in them. And of course, people like John Quincy Adams and those Northerners were not for this. Slavery is evil. Slavery is not good economically. Slavery is a violation of everything Americans hold dear. We need to find a way to wind it down. We need to find a way to put an end to it. And adding more slave states to the nation is not going to be good. The last thing we need to be doing is adding more. And this had been something that had been sort of brewing under the scenes for a while now, and it gets busted wide open with what will become known as the Missouri Compromise. Because the first time now, we're about to have a state enter the Union from west of the Mississippi River. And everybody is saying, is it going to be a free state or is it going to be a slave state? And its status as a free or slave state is going to shape the state itself, and it will either add more congressmen and senators from the slave states or more congressmen and senators from free. Y'all getting me, right? And so the Northerners said, we will not go along with another slave state. The number of slave states is done, no more. And the Southerners said, we are going to add another slave state. We must add another slave state. Just like the Constitution, what are we going to do? Well, you know the word already. We're going to compromise. We are going to compromise. Henry Clay, the old war hawk, where is he? There he is. Henry Clay, who was a Kentucky senator, the great compromiser. Henry Clay was the guy that could get anybody to compromise, and he will get many more done over the next few years. So we're going to keep an eye on old Clay. He brokers a compromise between the two sides, the Missouri Compromise. Missouri will be admitted as a slave state. Now, I want you to look at the geography of Missouri. It's kind of up north there, isn't it? Missouri is not really in the deep south. Geographically speaking, Missouri is actually north of the Ohio River, even though the river doesn't flow into Missouri. But you can see the Ohio River, the northern boundary of Kentucky there. Missouri is actually above that as far as latitude goes. So Missouri will be added as a slave state. Maine will be added as a free state. So we're not adding any imbalance. And right now, we have an equal number of slave and free states. It is exactly 50%. Half the senators are free, half the senators are slave. So we get 2 states instead of 1. And we will agree that slavery is prohibited in federal territory north of that southern Missouri border. The 3630 line, which is the southern border of Missouri, slavery will now be prohibited north of it. We will extend that ban on the Northwest Territory And you can see that's about where the Ohio River ends. Now understand, a state can do whatever it wants with slavery. A state can have slavery, it can abolish slavery, states can decide for themselves. But you see that big, gigantic orange area, that's federal territory. That's regulated by the Congress. And so the Missouri Compromise says federal territory north of that line will be slave-free. Federal territory south of that line can have slavery. And so that would be what would become Arkansas and then Indian Territory, later Oklahoma, but that's not until after the 20th century. But that means that Arkansas can later come in as a slave state. So that's the compromise. Missouri is a slave state, Maine is a free state. Federal territory north of that line is free. Federal territory south of that line is slave. The Missouri Compromise is the first time we see real contention over slavery on a federal level. And to be honest with you, all it did was put off the bigger debate for another generation. Just like with the Constitution, we kicked the can down the road by not dealing with it. With the Missouri Compromise, they kicked the can down the road again for another generation because they're looking at it and they're saying, this is good enough. But the issue of will slavery move west is not resolved. And certainly the issue of will slavery always be a part of our country is not resolved either. So those are the deeper issues. Okay, on that note, I think we're out of time. Oh, we most definitely are. Okay, everyone, remember the test next week. Get in touch with me for any issues, and I will see you later. Take care.